So what did you discover that surprised you while writing it?
Well, one of the things I discovered was I learned a lot about PTSD, and that was a learning. I'd heard of PTSD, but I didn't really think about it. And I remembered that I had a seminary student, excuse me, about 20 years ago, excuse me, who was struggling with some things, and she tried to teach me about PTSD, and she recommended a book that she wanted me to read. It was one of the classics at the time, so I did, to work with her better. Never occurring to me that I might be implicated by some of these things. And as I looked at my father, I realized, well, he had PTSD, and that actually explains a lot of things. It doesn't justify, but it does explain things. He lived through 2 wars, and he had a father who was far more abusive than my father. And as I was wrestling with that, I also realized, oh my goodness, I have PTSD too. And the PTSD helps explain the depression. It helps explain the mood issues. It helps explain why I've had so many migraines in my life. So that was a real discovery, and I'm coming to approach things now from what they call a trauma-informed perspective. So right now I'm preaching. I do a lot of preach. I preach almost every Sunday, and we're preaching, of course, on all the wonderful resurrection texts, Jesus' appearances, and those are all situations where Jesus is ministering to people who have been traumatized. I never saw it so clearly before, but that's the kind of healing that he's bringing. So I'm really having fun. I feel liberated with the PTSD perspective. I also happen to like Arthurian legends for some reason, King Arthur stories. And man, there's just trauma laced throughout them. So trauma's everywhere. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about.
Well, I think I'm really curious about the way that writing about the dead is a form of intimacy with them. So I've been writing about a long dead woman who's not a relative of mine. I've been sort of doing some historical writing, and I feel very intimate with this woman whom I've never met through writing about her. So I just wonder, Arthur, was this a kind of, did you find yourself having sort of intimate communion with your father in the writing? Or, you know, I think all of us believe in the communion of saints and the living presence of the saints to us. So I just wonder, was this writing prayer? Was this writing a way of being with him? I'll go on while you're thinking and say, this question leads me to think that one of the reasons I don't write about my own mother is that I actually think I don't want the intimacy with her that might come about.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question completely, Lauren, but this was a really good process for my relationship with my dad. My dad died over 30 years ago. I was 34 at the time. And one of the things that made me sad is some people who have read this book or excerpts of this book say, well, I don't like your father anymore. And that makes me sad, because that's not actually what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm not trying to settle scores or get even.
Right.
I'm trying to understand him, and I'm trying to explore the relationship. And I think I do understand him better. And his favorite hymn was a hymn called By the Sea of Crystal. It comes from its imagery from the book of Revelation. And he was not a very religious man, but whenever we sang that in church, he got emotional, and he would think about all our close relatives who had died already. And, you know, I like to think that he and I will be by the Sea of Crystal together, and we will see each other face to face, and we'll be able to talk about the things in this book. And those were not things he was able to talk about while he was alive. I tried to raise them a few times, and it just didn't go anywhere. And he didn't have the capacity at that time. And I feel all right about that. I also believe, as I've reflected on this, that my parents and my grandparents, you know, they lived through a depression. They lived through the Nazi occupation of World War II. My dad then volunteered for a very brutal war in Indonesia. Then they immigrated. They came with a crate of goods and $50. That's all that they were allowed to have. So they were totally focused on survival. They had to, they had to get bread and butter on the table. They had to stay safe from the Nazis. A neighbor was shot in my mother's tomato plants during the war. My father hid for a year in an attic of the family home because Nazi officers were billeted below. So I have no way of comprehending what that's like to be totally focused on survival. Whereas, I have a bachelor's in philosophy. I have time to write. I go to therapy. I have money for therapy. It's just a very different reality. And so I don't want to be, I don't want to be judging of other folks, of what they did or didn't do, of what they were or were not capable of doing.
Do you imagine what you want the reader to take away from this story?
I think that this is a story that is in some ways a painful story, but I think it's also a beautiful story. And I think beauty can emerge from pain. And I'm glad that I have learned to write in a more beautiful way so that I could tell the story in a beautiful way.